So, very good evening, everyone. It is my distinguished pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Amar Farooqui, one of India's most distinguished historians and a leading authority on colonial and modern Indian history. Professor Farooqui was a senior faculty member in the Department of History, University of Delhi, where he has contributed immensely as a teacher, researcher, and mentor over the past several decades. An alumnus of the University of Delhi, Farooqui completed his bachelor's, master's, MPhil, and PhD in history from the same, a testament to his deep academic roots in the university. He began his teaching career in 1983 at Hansraj College and later joined the Department of History at University of Delhi, where he has been teaching since 2004. He has also served as a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and is member secretary of the Indian Council of Historical Research (ICHR), further contributing to academic, administration, and research policies. Professor Farooqi's areas of study include colonialism and the opium trade, urban history, and the political economy of 19th century India. His path-breaking research has brought critical new perspectives on the colonial narcotics economy and the emergence of capitalist networks in the British India. Among his many influential publications are Smuggling, as Subversion, Opium City, The Making of Early Victorian Bombay, Sindhyas and the Raj, Ilfi Gwalior, Zafar and the Raj, and Your Mughal Delhi. And most important ones, early social formations. These works have reshaped our understanding of how empire operated through commerce, patronage, and urban transformation. Beyond his books, Professor Farooqui has published extensively in leading academic journals, and his work has been cited across disciplines in Indian and global historiography. He has guided numerous MPhil and PhD researchers and continues to be a valued mentor to emerging scholars. His intellectual engagement extends beyond the academy as well. His essays, editorials, and reviews have appeared in the Book Review, the Hindu, Mainstream, and the Indian Express, where he addresses key issues in history, education, and public memory. He is also an active participant in the Indian History Congress and serves on the editorial advisory board of the journal History and Sociology of South Asia. His work has been featured in international seminars and lectures, including at institutions in France, Portugal, and he has been invited to deliver prestigious addresses such as the Professor D.D. Koshambi Memorial Lecture and the Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Amar Farooqui, sir. We are very delighted to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm grateful to your this platform, Historiologus, for inviting me to speak on this part of your series of lectures and talks. And today I will be speaking on 1857, the revolt, its suppression, and colonial historiography. Now, as you know, this is a very vast subject, and the scholarship, the writings are very, very extensive. In fact, in the 1960s, there was a bibliography which was published by a publisher in Switzerland, which put together all the major writings on 1857. And at that time, when this bibliography was compiled, there were almost 1,000 publications on this subject. Now, this is in the mid-1960s. Since that time, the number of writings has grown many-fold. So one can see the amount of writing that is available on this subject. I will, of course, argue that there are very serious problems which make us sort of think, despite all this historiography, which would make us think whether this is the historiography is really well developed on 1857 or not. I'll come to that point a little later. Now, what I propose to do is to divide the discussion in two parts. I will begin with the first part will focus on a chronology of the events. Please don't think that this chronology will be just dry dates, because I do want to give an idea of some of the main phases of the struggle of 1857, 1858. And the second part will focus on colonial historiography, toward the end of which I will spend a little time discussing some of the writings which have appeared in the post-colonial period, in the period after 1947. Uh, now, as we know, the revolt was one of the most important anti-colonial struggles of the 19th century. In fact, if you look at the colonized world of the 19th century, you don't really find anything on this scale anywhere in parts of the world where Asia, Africa, Latin America, which had been colonized by the Western imperialist powers. So the scale itself makes this a very, very important event. The revolt occurred. The revolt was very, very widespread, and I need to make this point because a lot of the colonial historiography has tended to actually minimize the areas to the geographical spread of the revolt. It occurred in North India, in Central India, in Eastern India, in some parts of Northeastern India, in in parts of Punjab. So this is really a very the geographical spread is actually very, very extensive. Now, as all of you would know, the revolt itself was uh, sort of, one should say, spearheaded by the army of the East India Company. So, Sipahis of the East India Company, or Sepoys as they are referred to in colonial writings, they were in a sense the sort of vanguard of this struggle. And the revolt itself really began as a major mutiny in the army of the East India Company. Now, I want to spend about a couple of minutes talking about the army itself, because it's important to understand what army we are talking about. So, when we talk about the East India Company's army, we need to remember that this was, in fact, a private army. This was an army of the company. The East India Company, as you would all know, had been given a charter of trade through which it got a monopoly of the trade with the East Indies. East Indies refers to any area east of the Cape of Good Hope. So it had a monopoly of the trade. Monopoly meaning that nobody in England, in Britain, could carry out trade between Britain and Asia other than the East India Company. So the East India Company had a monopoly of the trade. It got a charter in 1600, and subsequently those charters were renewed. And in these charters, it also later on was given the authority to raise its own army. The point that I need to make is that this was a private army raised by the East India Company for its own sort of wars in India. And from the 18th century, early 18th century onwards, it is actually engaged in very, very extensive wars with the French, with various political entities in India. And this actually, the army itself began to grow during the course of the 18th century. So this army of the East India Company, we need to sort of have a little idea about its structure. The army itself was divided into three components. These were the Madras Army. Madras is where that is the army of the Madras Presidency. Madras is where the army was initially raised, and this is what came to be known as the Madras Army. Then there was the Bengal Army, and I'll have a little more to say. I'll come back to the Bengal Army, and then there was the Bombay Army. The Bombay Army was the army of the Bombay Presidency. In other words, it was the army of the East India Company operating in Western India. Now, it's important to remember that these three armies were separate components in the sense that they had different recruiting practices, they had their own organizational structures, they had their own commanders in chief. So the company didn't really have anything like a commander in chief of the army as a whole till much later. Even much later, it was the commander in chief of the Bengal army who was generally considered to be the sort of top ranking military official and often got to be referred to as the commander in chief. But strictly speaking, he was only the commander in chief of the Bengal army. So the Bengal army, let me now come to the Bengal army. So the Bengal army is the army of the Bengal presidency. The Bengal army is a bit of a misnomer because, in fact, the company did not recruit soldiers very extensively in Bengal. This brings me to the point of recruitment. So the armies were the recruitment policies of the three armies followed their own recruitment policies. The Bombay Army had its own policies. I will not go into that. The Madras Army had its own policies. I will not go into that. When I say policies, I mean the areas from it was it was recruiting its soldiers, or from those those sections of society from which it was recruiting its soldiers. The Bengal Army recruited the bulk of its soldiers from the Ganga Jamuna Doab. And in fact, a large number of its soldiers actually were acquired from what was the army of the kingdom of Awadh, or rather the Suba of Awadh. It wasn't really till much later referred to as a kingdom. It was referred to as the Suba of Awadh. So a large number of its soldiers actually came from the Awadh region or from the region of Western Bihar. These were the core areas of its recruitment. The Awadh region, central and eastern, what would sort of correspond to central and eastern Uttar Pradesh today, and the and western Bihar. So this was the core area. So the bulk of its soldiers are actually recruited from the Doab region, although this is referred to as the Bengal Army. There's one important point which needs to be noted in the context of the mutinies, which is that the army's soldiers were recruited from India, that's the Sipahis. All the officers were European, or rather British. So its entire officer cadre was exclusively European. So there was a very clear racial divide in the army. The officers are all British. They are recruited in Britain. They are trained in Britain because the company had a military academy in Britain where it trained its officers. And once they had undergone a period of training, they then got commissions in the company's army. So soldiers are Indian, that is Sipahis, who hardly had any opportunities for promotion. And the officers are all European. So that is the racial sort of structure of the army. Apart from the army, apart from the company's own army, which has these three components, Madras Army, Bombay Army, and Bengal Army, there was also the Royal Army, or rather the Queen's troops, which is a separate entity entirely. As I've said, the company's army is a private army. The Royal Army is a different entity. Of course, whenever there was any crisis, the company borrowed regiments from the Royal Army and they had to pay for that. So in the 1850s, there were a few regiments stationed, and this is the background. There were a few regiments that were stationed in India, European regiments, borrowed from the Royal Army. But the 1850s is a period of widespread colonial wars and wars in Europe. And let me just mention the two most important wars. One is the Crimean War, the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. This was a very difficult war for the British. I will not go into the details. You can pick up details from Wikipedia or anything else. Basic details, at least Wikipedia is okay. So the army itself, or you can pick it up from any standard textbook on European history. So the Crimean War of 1853, 1856. Now, a large number of the royal regiments had just fought this war before the revolt broke out, and this explains why the British had very few European regiments stationed in India. It took them a lot of time to reorganize their army, to get troops from the royal army, who would then come to India. So it took them quite a bit of time to do that. And there was one major colonial war also, which overlapped with the last phase of the Crimean War, and this was the Second Opium War in China. So the British had sent out troops into China as well for the war in China. So because of this situation, actually in India, there was a shortage of troops. The bulk of the troops actually was stationed in Punjab. Remember, the British have just conquered Punjab in 1849 at the end of two very fiercely fought wars. So a large proportion of its army is actually stationed in Punjab. So this is the military background. Now, what happened in 1857 was that against this backdrop, there is a mutiny in the Bengal Army. The mutiny was almost completely confined to the Bengal Army. But we should also remember that almost the entire army was in rebellion. This had become the major army of these three formations I've mentioned, Bengal Army, Bombay Army, and Madras Army. By the beginning of the 19th century, this had become the major army of the company. This was the army which was usually deployed in all major theaters of war, whether it is in Burma at one end or it is in Afghanistan at the other end. So all major wars have been fought by the Bengal Army. The army was obviously the most sort of well-trained, the most they had the widest experience of combat, and it also was the best equipped army. But you need to understand that the army had been constant, the Bengal army soldiers had been constantly in the field for nearly 3 decades, from the 1830s right up to the 1850s. I can't go into a list of the wars. You can look them up yourselves. But there were wars in Burma. I've mentioned Afghanistan. There were all wars in Punjab. There was the Sindh War. So they're constantly in the field. So this was really exhausting for these soldiers. On top of that, you have the experience of racial discrimination on a daily basis. The kind of remarks, the kind of comments, the kind of behavior of their European officers, the European officers towards the Sipahis. So the experience on a daily basis of racial discrimination, and then lack of sufficient avenues for promotion. Moreover, the pay of these soldiers had been static for right since the end of the 18th century. That also contributed to their grievances. On top of that, they were now expected to make use of an entirely new weapon. This was the P-53 Enfield rifle. As the name itself suggests, this was a particular type of the Enfield rifle was upgraded in 1853 with what is called the pattern 53 rifle, and this new firearm for the soldiers, this had certain specific features which, when they were introduced, were greatly resented by the soldiers. So to begin with, They are long series of wars are exhausting for them. No avenues of a promotion, pay scales are static, and then they have to train themselves to make use of a new weapon. Now, introducing a new weapon itself meant that these soldiers have to familiarize themselves with a new firearm which they have to use in the field. And this firearm came with a cartridge which was lubricated with the animal fat, which was taboo for religious reasons for these soldiers. Now, this weapon itself, the P-53 Enfield rifle, we are still in the days of front-loading rifles. Front loading rifles means that the bullet and the gunshot has to be loaded from the from the front of the barrel. So you must realize the difficulty of doing this. And in addition to this, when a new sort of bullet come cartridge, the cartridge is a kind of pouch which contains both the gunpowder, the powder, as well as the bullet. The powder has the bullet has to be, the cartridge paper has to be torn apart, and it has to be then poured into the barrel of the gun, and then the bullet has to be then pushed down into the barrel. So this requires actually the tearing apart of the paper covering of this cartridge. And since in order to facilitate pushing down this cartridge, the paper in which this was wrapped was lubricated. So the lubricant then became the one of the reasons around which there was a great deal of resentment, because the lubricant was animal fat, which was taboo for the soldiers. And since in order to make it easier for them to, while they are sort of quickly, please remember, I mean, it's a matter of a few seconds between one shot and another shot. The gun has to be, after one shot is made, the gun has to be immediately reloaded. So to facilitate that, it has to be torn by the teeth. And that then became a very, very emotive issue. This, of course, has figured so prominently in historiography that I don't need to get into this. I thought I'll just give you some idea of how this gun itself operated. Now, the earliest incidents actually in the Bengal Army, which were related to protests against these new P-53 rifle and its cartridges, occurred during drills where the soldiers were trained how to use this RP. So actually, it is when these soldiers are sort of being trained for this that the first protests actually begin. And this begins in one of the important cantonments, which is Barakpur. Barakpur is just on the outskirts of Calcutta. Of course, now it's almost a suburb of Calcutta. It's almost part of Calcutta. So it was in Barakpur where some of the earliest incidents occurred. But the most serious incident that occurred, as you all know, was at Meerut on the 10th of May 1857. So let me quickly now run through this. So Meerut was one of the important cantonments of the Bengal Army in the 1850s, or in previous decades. It had emerged as one of the most important cantonments of the army. And on the 10th of May 1857, the soldiers of this the Sipahis in Meerut, they rebelled. The mutiny took place. They took over the entire cantonment. Having taken over the entire cantonment, the soldiers, what is important, I'm not going to get into the details of what happened in Meerut. If there are questions, I can answer that later on. But let me just go into the details of what happened subsequently, because that's the politically important development. So having taken over the Meerut cantonment, they then decided towards evening, because all these incidents actually take place close to from the evening till dusk. And then by the time it is night, these soldiers as a body decide to march to Delhi. So, as a body, as a sort of, they together in their military formation actually march to Delhi. When I say military formation, I don't mean literally a military march, but they together they are all marching towards Delhi. In fact, it's very interesting that the in later when evidence was later on recorded of this, of the Europeans in European officers in stationed in Meerut, they said that, well, we didn't really know where these soldiers were going. We didn't even realize that they were marching to Delhi. We assumed that after having left the Meerut cantonment, they have dispersed into villages. But so the British really didn't know where they've gone. And but what happened was that they arrived in Delhi in early morning on the 11th, and this is a hot summer month, so it's already daybreak by the time they arrive. Once they've arrived, they cross the Jamuna, the boat of bridge, the bridge of boats, sorry, the bridge of boats, and then along the wall of the Red Fort, they gradually move into the city and then enter the Red Fort. Now, they already have obviously an idea about the sort of layout of the city, not only the layout of the city, but also of the Red Fort. So they enter the Red Fort. They appeal to the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah to bless their cause. And I must point out over here that in most of the colonial writings and also in standard textbook writings, it is stated that, well, they entered the fort and then they declared Bahadur Shah as the emperor or as the Shahenshah. The point is that they were not. The reason why they came to the Red Fort was because they recognized Bahadur Shah as the symbolic head of the East India Company's government. So it is not as though they were declaring him to be the emperor, but they came because symbolically they already had they recognized him as the emperor, because the East India Company, through various devices, actually considered the Mughal emperor as the de jure, not de facto, emperor. Having then requested him to bless their cause, again they were asking him to bless their cause. It's not as though they expected him to lead their revolt. Neither did they. They also were aware that he had no resources, and so they'd actually come to seek his blessings, and once so that his name could be associated with the revolt. Associating his name with the revolt was important to delegitimize the company's authority. So if you are going to say that the company's authority has been overthrown, then the next question obviously is, what is the legitimate authority? So what they were saying was that nominally, mind you, symbolically, it is the Mughal emperor who heads the state that these Sipahis are creating after having overthrown the company's authority. They take over Delhi, then they govern Delhi for the next 4 months. Delhi is under their control. They set up a very interesting institution, which again, I don't have time to go into the details, which has sort of modern democratic elements, called the Court of Administration. The leading members of this Court of Administration are elected from among the soldiers, or rather from soldiers' councils, and from among civilians in the city. So the 10 members of this Court of Administration, they are elected members. So there is an elective principle, and you can already see that there is a democratic element to the kind of institution that they are creating for governing Delhi. They are able to govern Delhi very efficiently because in the early stages of their takeover of the city, the police establishment of the city, that's the lower ranking police, the sort of ordinary constables who were part of the police machinery that the East India Company had created, had gone over to the rebels. And since the police establishment was so familiar with the city, how it was to be how things operated. They had local networks, they had local connections. It became possible for the Sipahis to actually govern the city. So the police establishment, which went over to the side of the rebels, that became important for governing the city during these 4 months. Now, just to complete the story of Delhi, I'll move to Kanpur quickly and say something about one or two other locations. So, the British, soon after Delhi had been liberated by the rebels, the British, they started frantically constituting some military force for the recapture of Delhi. Please remember that Punjab is under their control. Not only is Punjab under their control, but also the main routes linking Punjab with Delhi along the main trunk line, that is Ambala, Karnal, Delhi, that is still under their control. So what they start doing is they start raising troops in Punjab, of course, with great difficulty, because again, later on, this sort of myth was created that they were able to find a lot of support in Punjab. They were not. In fact, they had to. It is great difficulty that they put together contingents. Most of these are actually European troops which are stationed in different parts of Punjab, whom they put together along with some local troops from among princely states in Punjab. And having put these together, they constitute what was known as the Delhi Field Force. This Delhi Field Force marched towards Delhi via Karnal and reached the outskirts of Delhi in the first week of June, where they had an encounter with the military confrontation with the rebels. The rebels had a setback in this confrontation because they were not really prepared for this kind of confrontation. And the Delhi Field Force then marched through the northern suburbs of the city and took over the northern ridge. The northern ridge near the university campus. So they took over the northern ridge, and for the next 3.5 months or so, they are stationed on the ridge. So what they are trying to do is to recapture the city by locating themselves on the ridge. That itself is a fascinating story, and one could get into the details of that, but I'm not going to do that. And what they are actually doing is they are actually waiting for reinforcements from Punjab. So once those reinforcements arrive in early September, they launch a major offensive on the 14th of September. And after very fierce fighting in the city, they are able to recapture Delhi by the third week of September. But meanwhile, what has happened is that a large part of the Ganga Jamna Doab region of what is present-day Uttar Pradesh, of central India, and parts of western Bihar are in rebellion. In this area, I just want to mention Kanpur in particular because although the revolt was very short-lived in Kanpur, the fighting was very, very intense. At Kanpur. Kanpur was also a major cantonment. Please remember, Kanpur is situated on the frontier of what is at that time the region of Awadh. That's the kingdom of Awadh. It's on the frontier. You would know that the distance between Kanpur and Lucknow is just about something like 80 kilometers or so. So it's just on the frontier. And being on the frontier, it's a major cantonment, mainly for exercising control over Awadh. And on the 4th of June, the Sipahis at Kanpur, they mutinied. Kanpur was gradually brought under the control of the rebels, who then appealed to Nana Sahib. Nana Sahib was the adopted son and successor of Peshwa Bajirao II. Peshwa Bajirao II, at the end of the Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818, had been exiled to the outskirts of Kanpur at a place called Bithur, Bithur. So Bithur is where they are stationed, and following the death of Peshwa Bajirao II in early 1850s, his adopted son Nana Sahib had been declared the Peshwa, but had been declared his successor, but the British had refused to acknowledge his authority. And there's a long sort of correspondence on this whole issue in colonial records. Eventually, the rebels, after they had taken over the city, they appealed to Nana Sahib to lead their rebellion. And for the next few weeks, the entire area was under their control. Meanwhile, what has happened? This is important to our chronology. Meanwhile, what had happened? While these developments were taking place in Kanpur, what had happened was that the British had started putting together contingents of an army in Calcutta. Remember, they had very few contingents available to them, particularly European contingents. So what they are doing is they are getting soldiers from Madras and recalling soldiers from China. So with these soldiers, once they started arriving, they put together a force which then began moving from Calcutta through Banaras, Allahabad towards Kanpur. Please remember, their objective is to recapture the Grand Trunk Road. They don't have control over one part of the Grand Trunk Road. That is, from Delhi to Kanpur, they have no control. So what they are doing is that, on the one hand, the Delhi field force is moving from Karnal towards Delhi to recapture Delhi and then re-establish control over the Grand Trunk Road. And then there is on the other hand, the force that is coming from Calcutta. Eventually, this force which is marching from Calcutta, Banaras, Allahabad, reaches Kanpur. Kanpur is recaptured on the 17th of June, and massive sort of killing of local inhabitants, and in July, in 17th of July. Meanwhile, other areas like in Jhansi, there has been a rebellion on the 6th of June, Mutiny, which eventually is led by Rani Lakshmi Bai. And there are other areas, as for instance Lucknow, where also the city of Lucknow has been captured by the rebels from the 1st of July onwards. Lucknow is under their control. The British then, of course, carry out military operations. Most of these military operations are the real military operations take place actually in the early part of 1858. And eventually, by the time you come to the middle of 1858, most of the rebel areas have been taken over by the British. So that's broadly the chronology. The last sort of major struggle is in Gwalior, where Rani Lakshmi Bai attains martyrdom. Then there is the ongoing struggle which takes place in Bihar under the leadership of the legendary Kumar Singh. After his death in April 1858, his brother Amar Singh continues with this struggle. But all these are gradually the British are able to establish their control over these areas during the course of 1858. So when we say 1857, we must remember that actually some of the fiercest fighting really takes place in 1858. Now, I want to, in the time that remains to me, spend time on the historiography of the revolt. Because I did want, to give a broad idea of what was actually happening in the revolt, because of the kind of standard textbook treatment that we have, which really talks about Meerut and then forgets about what happens in the revolt with just one or two incidents, and goes into more details on things like causes and character and nature and things like that. So let me just spend a little bit of time on the next 20 minutes. I know I'm running out of time, but I do need 20 minutes to talk about colonial historiography. I've deliberately kept colonial historiography for a reason which I shall explain to you, because I'll just make a few concluding remarks on subsequent writings. But it's really important to understand what colonial historiography has done to our understanding of the revolt. The sort of impact has been so extensive that many of the ways in which revolt is understood, even today in standard textbooks, comes to us from what was written by colonial writers. Now, writings on the revolt began to appear right from 1857 itself. And the way in which the revolt was presented continued to be presented, as a mutiny by disgruntled Sipahis. And the argument was that, well, they didn't really have any real reason for doing this. And that kind of understanding continues in later writings. One of the earliest writings on the revolt is a massive 2-volume work by someone called Charles Ball. Massive. These are massive volumes, which together, these 2 volumes are something like 1,300 pages. And these are big sort of size volumes with a lot of illustrations also. But something that begins to be published towards the end of 1858, and most of these volumes have already been published by the end of 1858, maybe some portion by 1859. And this cannot be regarded really as a history. So in many writings, you will see Charles Ball as a historian, but actually Charles Ball is not really a historian, but somebody who actually compiles a lot of material which was at that time available in the public domain for people in England who are interested in knowing what's happening in India. So this can't really be, because in fact, you will see that in Charles Ball, events are still going on while many of these things are being written. So it's kind of work in progress in 57, 58. And this is not really, it's really a compilation of a lot of reports from newspapers, official papers, papers presented in British Parliament. All these are kind of compiled together. And this really cannot be regarded as as a historical account. Then there is another work which is very often quoted. And if you do a kind of Google search, you'll immediately come across this writer, L.E.R. Rees, who's supposed to have been a historian. So historian writing in 1858. But Rees is no historian. Rees, R-E-E-S. Rees was a merchant who resided in Lucknow. And when Lucknow was taken over by the rebels, he was took shelter in the British residency in Lucknow, and he wrote an account of what happened during this period when he was in the residency of in 1858, because there's a large audience already in England. There's a market for such writing. So he's again not to be regarded as any kind of historian. If at all there is a book which could be regarded as a kind of history, which was written as a history, it was a publication which started coming out in 1864. And this provided the model for subsequent writings. I'm referring here to the work of J.W.K., K-A-Y-E, J.W.K. J.W.K. was an official of the East India Company. He then embarked on a journalistic career, became a journalist, writer. Subsequently, in England, he joined the company's home service, because the company maintained in its headquarters also, its own establishment. So he joined that service, and he started writing on subjects relating to the company. In the 1850s, he had published a voluminous work on the Afghan War, the first Afghan War of 1839-1842, which has established his reputation as a historian. But strictly speaking, we can't really regard him as a historian. These are amateurs writing as his military experts, but he was actually even when he began writing, he was actually still an employee of the India office, because company came to an end, rule came to an end in 58, and its establishment was taken over by the India office under the Secretary of State for India. So his history, which is entitled History of the Sepoy War, was very widely read. These are massive, it's a massive history written in 3 volumes, 1864 first volume, 1870 second volume, and 1876 third volume. So these 3 volumes came out between 1864 and 1876. 1876, he died, and the work remained unfinished. And another official of the company who who spent a lot of time in India, a person by the name of George Mallison, Malleson. He, after his retirement, he retired and went back to England in the 1870s, and he began he started writing a history of the work, which was a kind of continuation of what Kay had been writing. These two volumes were then subsequently published as a single 6-volume set by the publisher entitled History of the Indian Mutiny by J.W.K. and George Mallison. They are not collaborators, they are not sort of writing as a team. Mallison takes over after Kay's death. But this became the standard sort of massive 6-volume work on the revolt. The important point about this, and that's also what is important in my title, is that this book, in its 6 massive volumes, is not a history of the revolt. It became the standard, almost authorized, because this is almost a kind of commissioned, sort of authorized work, official authorized work. So it must be regarded as semi-official history. But these massive six volumes cannot be regarded as a history of the revolt. They are, in fact, a history of the suppression of the revolt. We need to make this distinction, because this is a history, and all subsequent histories were written in this way, that they are not interested in what the rebels are doing, what's happening in India, what the problems of the Sipahis are, what the problems of the civilian population are. They are not interested in those issues. For them, what is important is the suppression of the revolt. And while writing of the suppression of the revolt, what they are trying to create is British heroes who have played an important role in restoring the empire. So it becomes then a story of heroes, British heroes, in which the British are heroes, Indian rebels are the villains. And they are not so much interested in these Indians. Indian names will appear because when they are talking about specific events, they have to talk about certain events in which Indians do figure. But they are not writing their history. Their perspective is very clear. Unfortunately, we keep on referring to these as histories of the revolt. These, first of all, they are not histories because they are not written by professional historians. One of the things that you will find completely missing in Kay's history or in Mallison's account is the complete absence of any references or footnotes. No professional historians write like that. Professional historians have their own protocols. When they are referring to something, when they quote something, they always provide the reference. When they are saying something, when they are making a statement, they provide the appropriate references. You will find none of this in the in Kay and Mallison volumes. So these are not works of professional historians, neither are they written in the way professional historians write. One can write a good popular history, but at the same time, you would need a lot of references. None of that is there in these massive volumes. Just flip through these. They are available on the internet. It's not very difficult to have a look at them. So, first of all, they are not written by professional historians, not written in a way professional historians write, following the protocols of historical writing. But more importantly, they are not histories of the revolt because they are not interested in the reasons for what the rebels are doing. They are not interested in their actions. Rather, they are only interested in creating these sort of superhuman heroes who are really British heroes, who are engaged in the task of putting to an end the revolt and, or rather the mutiny, because they always talk of the mutiny, and restoring the British Empire. So then this becomes a story not of the revolt, but of the restoration of empire something that is done by the great heroes who are engaged in this struggle. Similar accounts subsequently came out using this model. So when you're saying subsequent accounts, you're really talking about subsequent sort of histories which use K and Malleson as their default kind of format. That's the way in which this becomes the model for all subsequent writing, which is a story of the suppression of the revolt by British superhuman British heroes. One of the works which in the latter half of the 19th century became extremely popular, let me just mention that, and then I'll quickly say a few words about writings of the 20th century, just a few sentences. So the problem, very few people would be interested in, ordinarily reading through these 6 massive volumes. They were to be found in almost every major library in England or in India at that time. Even today, you would find these volumes in most libraries, older libraries in particular, older institutions. But there was space for a single volume work, which would cover these events in considerable detail, but not in too much detail, and give a general account to the interested reader. And a book of this kind was published in 1883. Entitled, again, History of the Indian Mutiny, written by a person called T. Rice Holmes, Holmes. This is a single volume work, extremely readable, and this became very popular because this kind of work condensed a lot of what K and Malleson had to say, but also made use of a lot of other writings which had become available by that time. This was written by a school teacher, so it had a sense of how to convey things in simple ways, in a simple narrative to a lay or to popular audience, and that's why it became a great bestseller. Rice Holmes' History of the Indian Mutiny. Toward the end of the century, there's still a lot of writings that are coming out. And here I do want to make this general point that all these writings carry further the colonial narrative, for which the model had been provided by K and Malleson. There is nothing to challenge this narrative. There's nothing to challenge this narrative because the reign of terror that was unleashed by the British after 1857, in that atmosphere, it was impossible to publish anything that challenged that narrative. It became possible to challenge that narrative only as a political task. And that is something which could only happen with the emergence of the national movement at the beginning of the 20th century. One important work against the backdrop of the Swadeshi movement was the History of the Revolt by V.D. Savarkar. This was published initially in Marathi, then translated and published in 1909 in its English translation as the Revolt of 1857. But again, please remember, it was immediately banned. And you can see how the colonial state is so sort of, it is intolerant of any kind of dissent in this matter, and this any attempt to challenge the narrative of the revolt. I can mention another work which actually came out in 1907 but was published kind of clandestinely, a book called Majha Pravas. This was initially published in Marathi. Now it's available in English, in 2 or 3 English translations actually. This is the narrative of, this is the account of a priest who traveled from Konkan was traveling to North India from the Konkan, and he got caught in the events of 1857. And after coming back, he wrote an account of what had happened. And this was published. This account was initially, an unpublished account, but subsequently 1907 it is actually published, and but it is published clandestinely because again there was such fear about how the colonial state would treat such an account. I can also mention another work which was published in 1929 by another important nationalist, Pandit Sundarlal, great Gandhian nationalist leader, who published a book in Hindi called two massive volumes called Bharat Mein Angrezi Raj. Bharat Mein Angrezi Raj, and a large part of the second volume, part of this work actually deals with the revolt. When this book was published, it was again immediately banned. So you can see how difficult it is to publish anything in this period which challenges the colonial narrative. And it only became possible after 1947 to attempt writing histories which would challenge the colonial narrative. And one important moment in this was 1957, when the 100th anniversary of the revolt was being commemorated. Around that time, in 1957, there were several writings which appeared, and let me just mention two or three very significant works which appeared around that time. One was a book which was actually commissioned by the government of India. This was a book written by a historian, actually historian of the Marathas, Surendranath Sen. Surendranath Sen wrote a work which came out, it's still available. It was published by the Publications Division, entitled 1857. The title of the book is a very straightforward, simple title. He didn't get into this whole debate on, in the title on whether it's a mutiny, whether it's a rebellion, whether it's a revolt, uprising, all these issues. He just titled it 1857. But in fact, it's an important work because it actually is the first major attempt to write a history of the revolt from a different perspective, from the perspective of those who were participants in the rebellion. And it also provides a kind of all India perspective of the revolt, because you will see that actually the chapters are arranged geographically. So he moves from region to region to tell a kind of all India story. All India. He also includes some discussion on southern India incidentally in this book. Another important work which came out was by Shashi Bhushan Chaudhary. Shashi Bhushan Chaudhary, again, is a professional historian, taught at Presidency College. Although he was a historian of ancient India, but he got interested in the revolt, studied the archival material available in Calcutta in great depth, and produced this very important work entitled Civil Rebellion in the Indian Mutinies, in which he actually tried to show the connection between the mutiny and the civilian, the popular rebellion. So he was saw this as a popular rebellion, but he also tried to see the organic connection between the rebellion and the popular rebellion and the mutiny in the army. So Shashi Bhushan Chaudhary's work is another important work which came out. Then there is R.C. Majumdar's work on the revolt, which examined the historiography on specific issues in the revolt. Specific issues. He looks at the issue of the cartridge. He looks at the question of nationalism. He looks at the issue, some of the other causes of the revolt. So these he tried to look at some of the historiographical issues that are involved in the revolt. Then there was a collection of essays which looked at the revolt from a Marxist perspective, edited by P.C. Joshi. It was entitled, and the title is significant, Rebellion 1857, a Symposium. A symposium. So this was supposed to be a symposium, indicating that a lot of this thing is in the it's the beginning of a debate on the whole question. Then there is another work which I might mention, which came out in 1958, but just to coincide with the rebellion. This is Mehdi Hussein's the revolt of Bahadur Shah Zafar and the revolt of 1857 in Delhi. in which he actually reproduced a lot of very important archival documents, including documents which he translated relating to the revolt. So it remains a very important work. So this marks a historiographical shift. The writings of 1957, that's the centenary year, mark a historiographical shift. That's when professional historians actually start writing about. These are professional historians, professionally trained historians. They might not be historians of modern India because there weren't really modern India specialists in the sense we understand them today. So these, but they were professionally trained historians, knew how to evaluate their evidence, knew how to sort of use that evidence to ask questions, archival records to ask questions, and to then write histories of a different kind. There are writings then in the 60s, 1960s. I don't want to go into too much detail. I'm not moving from decade to decade, but I do want to mention one particular work by J.A.B. Palmer, Palmer, on the outbreak of mutiny in Meerut, in which it very interestingly actually put together most of what was known about what had happened at Meerut to actually look like a lawyer, and he had some legal training, at the sequence of events to understand actually what had happened. If I have time, I might go into that later in the discussion. But the most important, and I'll sort of more or less conclude with this, shift actually came in the 80s and 90s, when a set of writings began to look at popular participation in the revolt, looking at this popular participation in terms of peasant resistance. And here there are three names I would like to mention. One, Eric Stokes, who published his Peasants and the Raj, 1978. And another work which came out posthumously in 1986, collection of his articles on 1857, edited by C.A. Bailey, which was entitled The Peasant Armed. All these two sort of books actually look at this whole issue of 1857 in the context of peasant resistance. And it is again in this context, from this perspective, that a very important work was published in 1984. 1984, Rudrangshu Mukherjee, The Revolt in Awadh. Again, this is and in fact, this is one of the most important works on 1857 because it actually looks at the way in which the rebellion took place in the countryside, the rural areas of Awadh. And it looks at the peasants, it looks at the big landholders, the talukdars, it looks at the relationship between these two, it looks at their grievances against the British, against the East India Company, its revenue policies, and so on. So this remains actually one of the most path-breaking works on 1857. And a little after that, in 1994, you have another work which looks at Bundelkhand from the same perspective. This is Tapti Roy's work, The Politics of Popular Uprising, which actually looks at the uprising in the Bundelkhand region, where Jhansi, of course, was very important, but then she also looks at what is going on in the countryside, in the rural areas of Bundelkhand in great detail. And then the 150th anniversary of the revolt became an important occasion for a lot of writing on 1857, and a lot of symposiums, seminars, conferences took place around that time, which produced a lot of research, a lot of papers, a lot of writing on particularly the place of marginalized sections of society in the revolt. So, in a sense, the task remains still, this is an ongoing kind of research, because the impact of colonial historiography has been so damaging to an understanding of the revolt that it took a lot of time for the for histories of the revolt to big research, really serious research, to begin on 1857, and we must regard this as a kind of ongoing project, which I'm sure some of you would at some point of time might be interested in undertaking this kind of research. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. I'm, we are very grateful to you. And the most important part is the readings that you have provided, the so long reading list. That's very important if you want to continue further for the research. Now we'll move towards the question answer session. The floor is open for questions. I would request to either raise your hand or drop your questions in the chat box, and then I'll ask to you, post to sir. Before that, I would like to ask you one question. Since you mentioned and since we know that the revolt was more or less centered to northern India, particularly Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Bundelkhand region, Gwalior and others. So I wanted to know that why was Punjab region untouched by the rebel forces? Just a second. I think you're unable to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're unmute.
Yeah. So, we could have a separate discussion on Punjab itself, but let me tell you that, this is, it's a myth of colonial historiography that, sorry, uh, it's a, it's a myth of colonial historiography that nothing happened in Punjab, because this the one of the reasons for this myth was that the recruitment policies of the military recruitment policies actually changed after 1858, and there was growing emphasis on recruitment from Punjab. Given the fact that Punjab became such an important, and we are talking here of Greater Punjab, British Punjab, which and also the princely states of Punjab. So this is a Punjab which extends from Delhi. Please remember, after 1858, Delhi also became administratively a part of British Punjab. So we are talking of a region which extends from Delhi right up to the Khyber Pass. That's the Punjab we are talking about. Yeah. So this became the main recruiting area for the British increasingly after 1858. Given the a very large proportion of troops of soldiers began to be recruited from this region. So, given the overwhelming importance of this region as a recruiting ground, it became a kind of necessity for the British to actually propagate the myth that nothing had happened in Punjab in 1857. But right from the beginning of the revolt, first of all, please remember that a large part of the army is stationed in Punjab. And there are mutinies taking place right from Lahore, Amritsar, right up to Peshawar in 1857. In fact, in Ambala also. In fact, on the same, just a little before even the outbreak of the mutiny the outbreak of the mutiny in Meerut, a mutiny had broken out in Ambala, which is not very far from Meerut, in fact. So to think that nothing was happening in Punjab, I mean, this entire information was carefully suppressed, and this myth was built up. Not only that, the events in some of the parts of Punjab are actually very major events. One of the important events was something that is known as the massacre at Ajnala, not very far from Amritsar, where troops which were stationed near Amritsar, they were marching to join other rebels. They were sort of trapped while on their march, and they were then sort of placed in captivity. Many of them died of suffocation. Many of them were then killed. And this became, this was one of the most tragic events that actually took place in Punjab during the revolt, the massacre at Ajnala. These troops are just massacred, or else they die in captivity. So that history is to be found. I mean, it's not as though this history was unknown. This history was there's an account of that written by senior officials who were posted in Punjab at that time about what happened in Ajnala. But precisely because of the fact that this myth was being created, this kind of got ignored. And in recent years, Professor K.C. Yadav actually wrote a series of articles and also small book in which K.C. Yadav, he passed away unfortunately in the recent pandemic because he was doing a much bigger work on this. He has written a series of articles and also a small book on what had happened in Punjab, in which he has actually seriously contested this understanding that nothing had happened in Punjab. In fact, one of the points which I had made at the beginning of my discussion when we were talking about Delhi, you will remember that when the Delhi Field Force was being put together, John Lawrence, who was at that time the Chief Commissioner of Punjab, he was trying desperately to get soldiers. The picture that we have is of a large number of British soldiers from Punjab suddenly joining the army. In fact, what happened was John Lawrence is constantly writing to other officials saying that I can't find any recruits in Punjab. I can't get these people to join the Delhi Field Force. So to think that these troops are sort of easily available in Punjab is again a myth. So given the fact that this became a major recruiting ground for the British in the latter half of the 19th century, post 1858, but more so after the 1880s, this myth was carefully nurtured that nothing had happened in Punjab.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. Next, I would.
By the way, there are one or two articles by K.C. Yadav which are easily available on the net, which will give you at least the basics of this understanding.
Yeah, Ajitesh, please briefly introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Uh, Hi, Professor. I wanted to, a few days ago, I met Surinder Kochar, who had discovered this in Ajnala well in which the bodies of these soldiers were buried in Punjab.
Yeah.
So uh, he uh, he told me all about it. So these soldiers had actually rebelled, outside, you can say, the ambit of mainland India. They were in Miamir cantonment of Lahore. So I was wondering that how did the message was passed on to them, since they were so far away from the last outpost of, like, mostly this whole phenomena of this rebellion is told to be centered around the central Gangetic plain and central and eastern India. So how did they manage to get the message there? And the second is that what was the rationale of rebellion in that, in Punjab? Second was that I was reading this paper of S.K. Bajaj, who had written it for Punjab History Congress proceedings, and he had refuted this myth that Sikhs were actually angry on the Central Indians who had joined forces with the British to defeat uh, Sikh Empire, so that it was the vengeance in which they joined the forces with British to defeat the Central Indian mutiny and the soldiers of Central India. So how true is it? And I mean, there is already a refutation, but it is still sounded very much by the Punjabi nationalists. They talk about it. It is one of the main points of today's Khalistan movement. So I would like to hear from you about it.
I won't sort of get into contemporary politics on this whole issue, but there are two or three points, which I would like to make. One is that, first of all, let us please understand, this is the point I was making when I was discussing historiography, that a lot of historical research still needs to be done on many of these aspects, which were either downplayed or ignored or distorted in colonial historiography. So even to sort of begin recognizing that there were things that were happening in Punjab, and it's not just Punjab. There are some very interesting writings actually which have come on what was happening in the Madras Presidency. If I have time, I can talk about that, which make us sort of just because sometimes you have this block that nothing happened, so there's no point in researching on this. So a lot of research actually is required. So let me be very frank that what one talks about is on the basis of a very limited writing which has challenged existing received sort of wisdom on this. And KC Yadav I consider as one of the most prominent figures among senior historians who've been writing on this subject. Now, so having sort of keeping in mind the paucity of research, let me just make one or two statements in the light of what you said. But one is, how did they communicate? Now, this is not just a problem for Punjab. This is a problem we need to actually resolve for the Ganga Jamna Doab, for Eastern India, for Central India as well. We really, because what the British were writing really were histories of this suppression, they really didn't pay much attention to these aspects. They would make some broad generalizations, and that's about all. So a lot of this kind of thing. So, for instance, I mentioned that events had occurred at Ambala, which is just 200 kilometers from Meerut, just before the mutiny occurred at Meerut. What is the link between the two? We still don't know, except for a conjecture that there must have been some coordination. What coordination, how it took place, we don't know. We also know that in the Doab, there are mutinies taking place immediately after what happened at Meerut, at Bulandshahr, at Etawah, at Manpuri, at various other places, at Bareilly. Within 2 weeks, these soldiers in these cantonments are up in arms. So what is the way in which this news is traveling? Is there a prior consultation? Is there no prior consultation? We don't know. And there must have been, please remember that a large proportion of the army, Bengal Army, is actually stationed in Punjab. So what would be true for the Doab would be true for those regions also. What are the communication channels? And if we know there are communication channels, we know that the British, there are official channels, but then there are other channels also. So obviously they're using channels of communication which are already there. The army is already stationed in Punjab for a long time. First Punjab War, then comes the second Punjab War. Now, that still is something which remains rather obscure. We really are not able to. That's why I mentioned this work by J.B. Palmer is an important work, because the way he just looks at a couple of hours, places that under the microscope to see what happened at Meerut, and then sort of draws some very interesting conclusions. That's the kind of research that I'm really talking about, which we need to do for other areas as well. About the Punjab problem again, please remember, that they were the broader story is something that we sometimes tend to overlook, which is that after all, the soldiers of Punjab, the great army of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, had fought two major wars which the British could have almost lost. If you look at the history of these two campaigns, the first Punjab War and the second Punjab War, you would actually find that they could have easily lost these wars. The soldiers kept on fighting. So to assume that overnight, after 18, and the British were extremely hostile to them. In fact, initially for the first few years after 1849, they did not even recruit any soldiers from Punjab. So they'd only recently started recruiting just a little before the revolt took place. So, given this kind of hostility of the company to the soldiers in Punjab, uh, one needs to sort of understand whether it would have been very easy for them to recruit soldiers when 1857 occurred. And this is very obvious from the any sort of, I mean, this is there in the public domain. What John Lawrence is constantly writing back and saying, the problems that I'm having, I can't get recruits. When just to complete this point, the commander in chief at that time of the Bengal Army, George Anson, was in Shimla when he got news of what had happened at Meerut, and within a few days, immediately after that, he decided to march in the direction of Delhi. And for doing this, he had to actually put together. So he said, let me put together whatever European contingents and other troops I can find. And it is with great difficulty that he even found European troops, because there were few European troops and they were kind of scattered in this very large area. He put them together and then started marching. So the story of, if you were to look carefully at what happened to the initial stages of the Delhi field force, you would find that it was extremely difficult. And even after reaching Delhi, they're sitting on the ridge waiting for several months for reinforcements. It takes them a long time. So I think, all this requires a relook. I don't have ready answers to any of these things because, as I said, this is really research in its infancy.
Thanks, Professor. Moving further, Prem Srivastava, please go ahead with your. Please be brief.
Good evening, sir. I'm a first year student of history at the University of Delhi. Uh, Forgive me if you have already answered this in your lecture, but I wanted to know was what made the Deccan and the Madras region more docile, if that's the word, as compared to the northern plains? Why was there much more furor over reforms, over like the rifle and all of those things in the northern regions as compared to the southern regions?
Yeah. So, this is a question which has bothered a large number of historians of the revolt, who've been looking at, the revolt from an all India perspective. And one way of answering this question would be that the revolt that a large, many of, one has to there's a correlation between the sort of intensity of resistance and the expansion of empire. So many of the regions of parts of southern India which had come under colonial rule at a much earlier, they have histories of very, very fierce resistance. Let me remind you that the first major mutiny in the company's army actually occurred in the Madras Army in 1806. 1806 is the first major mutiny in the company's army, and that takes place in Madras, in the Madras Army, very close to Vellore, very close to Chennai, actually. So this has to. So, and then there are other moments of resistance in the history of resistance in southern India. There are other important moments as well, which I could talk about. A little before that, in fact, is what is known as the Polygar Wars, which are also very fierce resistance by chiefs in large parts of Tamil Nadu. So that's one way in which you can sort of look at this whole question. But there is another thing that I would like to place before your consideration, and which is that it is not as though nothing was happening in the Madras presidency. In fact, if you go through Surendranath Sen's book, when he's talking about development, the situation in the south and so on, he actually, in the same paragraph, makes two statements. One of which comes from an earlier understanding which is a kind of sort of survival of an earlier understanding, where he says that, well, nothing was happening in the South. In the South, you say docile, he uses the term loyal, and so on. A lot of that vocabulary, actually, loyal, comes from colonial writings also. But just a few sentences before this statement, in the same paragraph, he makes another statement which he doesn't really account for. He says that 1044 sepoys of the Madras army were court-martialed. And he doesn't sort of look at that question any further. But there has been subsequent research on this whole issue. One of the scholars who's written on this, some of his writings are easily available on the net, N. Rajendran, Professor N. Rajendran, who actually looks at what these 1,000 or so sepoys were doing. So they were suspected of actually organizing a mutiny in the Madras army. So it's not as though nothing, this area was disaffected. The entire area was completely unaffected. There are echoes of what's happening. Not only that, even in a distant town like Salem, there are ordinary people, most of them weavers, who are actually expecting, because some rumor has been afloat that soldiers who have liberated, Madras presidency, they will be marching into the town on a particular date, and they line up the streets. Things happen in a few other parts of Madras presidency. I could cite a couple of other incidents at Chingalport and one or two other places as well. So we need a little more of this kind of history to understand. Once we sort of put away this understanding that, well, nothing happened, the intensity might not be the same as what happened in North India. And there are explanations, as I said, if the intensity might have been greater at a moment when, just when colonial rule was being established. But that nothing happened, that people were happy with colonial rule, I think, that's something which needs to be seriously questioned, even in the context of southern India.
Thanks, first, Farooqui. Now, I would request somehow to please proceed with the question. Yes, go ahead somehow.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
So, sir, I was wondering, since given the dominance of colonial historiography, you mentioned how early historiography was dominated by colonial schools. Then, how did these historians, these professional historians, manage to get the history of the Indian side of the rebellion or mutiny, especially when there were such limited sources and there was no popular history or there was no history from below or any such thing at that point of time. So how did they manage to break away from the colonial historiography, given the sources itself were dominated by the colonials?
So the point that I was making was that, this was partly a task which could be undertaken only when there was either a political context or after 1947, when things when it became possible to write these histories. I just gave a few examples of what happened to some of those writings which challenged the colonial narrative. Now, please understand, it's very difficult to today understand what the atmosphere was in the period after the revolt, after the suppression of the revolt. We need to ask this question that on the one hand, there's such a huge amount of writing from the colonial perspective, huge. There are memoirs, there are letters written by ordinary soldiers, which are then put together and published. There are so many popular histories of the revolt. There are histories which deal with a particular location, Lucknow, Delhi, Kanpur, or Patna, or Ara, or whatever, other, or Gwalior, Agra. So, the amount that is produced, it has sort of flooded the what I might say the 1857 market. It just flooded with this kind of writing. Huge amount of writing. On the other hand, on the Indian side, there's hardly anything. Hardly anything. I'm not suggesting nothing was being written. There must have been a lot of writing that is circulating in sort of private spheres, underground, clandestinely, but nothing in the public domain. We can hardly find any writing of that kind. One of the writings that I mentioned to you, Maja Pravas. Obviously, it circulated underground. That manuscript was there, available since the 1880s. People were aware of it. It's only in 1907 it get published. When it got published, even then it was published clandestinely. So any book that is written which is challenging the colonial narrative immediately gets banned. So it's a very difficult thing to do that. Very, very difficult. But after 1947, you have professional historians beginning to write that kind of account. How did they write? Now, please remember, again, historians can't be sort of say that, obviously there are people who got interested in this subject. Why does somebody take up a historical subject, Why does somebody undertake research on a particular theme? So you get interested. I mentioned Shashi Bhushan Chaudhary. Shashi Bhushan Chaudhary was not a historian of modern India at all. He was a historian of the ancient period. His first book is actually in the Mauryas. But he's a trained historian, and for whatever reason, we can't get into personal motive. We don't know. He got interested in this. He taught history. He got interested in this. He started going to the archives, started collecting a huge amount of material. That brings me to another point. Please remember that till the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s, it was impossible for Indians to go and look at archival material. Where will they access that material? It's not like today, you have to go to an archive, say, provide some letter of introduction saying you're doing a research project or you're a PhD scholar or MPhil scholar, and they'll give you the permission to consult records. It wasn't like that. It was so difficult for Indians to get admission. In any case, these were not records which are available in the public domain. And for Indians, it was even more difficult. Till at least the 30s, 1930s, it was impossible. So we need to keep in mind all these constraints when we realize why it is that only after 1947 it became possible to start writing. And I think that, that's my own sort of understanding that for many, historians, 1957 became an important moment to reassess the kind of history that had been written on 1857. And all these writers, they have different perspectives, mind you. They don't have the same perspective. But they are looking at 1857, whatever has been written about 1857, very critically, and also using archival material, which so far it has not been possible for at least Indians to use while writing histories of the revolt. It's not till you come to the 1980s that what you refer to as late 70s, early 80s, that historians start looking at it in terms of, if you prefer that term, a history from below, in terms of peasant resistance. 70s or 80s से पहले नहीं होता ही, 1970s or 1980s से.
Thank you so much, bro. Next, now we'll take the last question session from the audience. Mohammed Ali, please go ahead. Please be short with your question.
Hello, I'm Muhammad Ali, sociology graduate from Calicut University.
Yeah.
I heard that this mutiny felt because of it was spontaneous and there is a lack of coordination, and it doesn't have a all India manner. Because of the reasons, this mutiny failed in some standard history textbook. And after your session, I just got I get that it has a some kind of coordination, and it was not a spontaneous, and it does have a kind of all India manner. And what do you say about that?
So, these are still matters of great debate. Was it how it was much of it was spontaneous, was not spontaneous? What was the extent of coordination? What one point, of course, a general point that we need to make it that a lot of throughout, if you look at histories of popular resistance, you would find a lot of popular resistance all over the world is actually a lot of it is actually spontaneous. So there's always a great deal of element of spontaneity in popular resistance. If there is some coordination in this, then we are talking about it not so much in the context of popular resistance as in the context of the soldiers coordinating among themselves. Now, how they coordinated, when that question was asked on Punjab, I had pointed out that we still are not able to understand that. There might have been some coordination, there might have been prior consultation, the soldiers are in touch with each other. But until we actually get that evidence, the historian is so dependent. We need a little bit of evidence to provide an answer to that. If we can trace a couple of letters, if we can trace some correspondence which shows, this coordination taking place, then we might be able to say things more definitely. We are only assuming. This is only conjecture. Historians are bound by their evidence, So we are only assuming that there might have been some kind of loose coordination. So if there is a coordination, it must be at the level of the soldiers. But then when soldiers establish links with the civilian population, and wherever they were successful, they had links with the civilian population. Usually, wherever they were unable to establish tap into local networks, they were not very successful in sustaining their mutinies. So how they establish those networks, how they establishes those linkages, this is something we still need to understand. We still need to understand that, So, but there must have been some coordination. Or rather, I should not say must have been. I mean, there's a good possibility of there being some coordination, because you must also remember that these are soldiers who are highly trained. This is a very well organized army. They also keep rotating. They don't stay put in one cantonment. The British keep on rotating them. So that gives a chance to them to get to know soldiers in other places also and establish contacts in other places also. So I could give you a couple of those specific references to that. But please remember that also gives an opportunity to soldiers to sort of meet and get to know wahan kya ho raha hai, what's happening over there, how are things over there, what are people thinking over there, what are soldiers thinking over there. So there must have been, there's a high possibility that there would have been some coordination. But till we actually find evidence of that, we are handicapped as historians.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question. I have two questions, if you allow. So I wanted to know about the women question. Since there are many sources that talk about that the Indian sepoys had attacked the English women. And some historians like
English,
says
that the sepoys, what did they, what in the women?
The sepoys had raped and molested the English women. The very general popular myth. So I just want to know your view, or do you find any source from the Indian perspective? Was it so?
Okay. So if it is specifically about European women, you see, from whatever evidence we have, and this was actually examined this issue in great detail by Edward Thompson. E.P. Thompson was Edward Thompson's son, in a book called The Other Side of the Medal. And some of some of these issues did come up in some of the inquiries also after 1858. Now, this might, this would sound very, very sort of brutal and cruel. And Rudrangshu Mukherjee actually has an essay on Kanpur in this on the question of violence. But let me sort of say that the tendency generally was of the rebels when they were in an organized form. They tended to kill Europeans, irrespective of whether they were men or women. So that and this question of molestation or sexual assault is something that did come up in a number of inquiries, but they did not really yield. I mean, the British would have really sort of publicized a lot of this if these incidents were there. But that evidence they did not really find. On the other hand, there are also those other instances. There's that a very well-known book by Ruskin Bond, Flight of Pigeons, जिस पर जुनून बनी थी श्याम बेनेगल की, which also shows another dimension of this, when these women are targeted, then how they are kind of given shelter and so on. So there are those other kinds of stories also, which we actually have. But in fact, I should say that the evidence for this is really lacking. There might have been stray incidents, one can't say, but these soldiers, because these are ultimately, they're making a particular political point, and it doesn't serve their purpose to really sort of do this kind of thing.
I would like to ask you repeatedly about the professional. That is the need of the time, because our discipline is affected by the non-professional.
So you're not very audible. You're not very clear, Aditya. I can't hear you very clearly.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
So next, I want to know about the professional historians a bit in detail. Since our discipline, is now under attack by the non-professional historians who are not trained in historical methodology and they're writing history. So how do we deal with this?
See, non-professional historians, when they write history, there's nothing really that you can do except for popularize some good history writing. That's all you can do. You can't say, people will write, people will say, there were non-professional historians earlier also. So the only way, but I would say, that there are, when I was talking about popular history writing and the way in which Kay or Malleson were writing, I think, they're sort of unprofessional. When I say unprofessional, I mean, even though they are not trained, at least they can make use of certain protocols of history, of historians. And I must say that there are sort of a lot of popular people writing popular histories today who do provide references. They might not be academics, but when you look at their writings, so I think that's the way to go about it. Because even for a popular audience, please don't think that they don't want to know कि इसका source क्या है. आप कोई बात अगर कह रहे हैं, what is the source of this? They want to know. They might not want to check up on every reference, but there might be certain statements which want them. So if you want to, follow that protocol, you need to go according to the way in which the techniques of the historian have developed. And for the historian, please remember the footnote is always very, very important.
So thank you so much, sir. By this, we come to the conclusion of the session. We are really grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.